I received an invitation to my family's Thanksgiving dinner after nearly 5 years of almost no contact. Just a short message from my mother. Come home for dinner, the whole family will be there. No apology. No questions about how I'd been. And yet, my heart still trembled. A part of me wanted to believe this was a chance to reconcile, to finally be acknowledged, to feel what family was supposed to mean. I lay awake for nights, debating with myself. Should I return to the place that had once hurt me so deeply? Should I face the same cold stares and cutting remarks that had followed me throughout my childhood? In the end, I decided to go back. Not for them, but for me. I wanted closure. I needed to know whether I still had any place left in that family. I prepared carefully for that evening, a simple yet elegant dress, neatly styled hair, a calm and steady demeanor. I reminded myself to stay strong, not to let anyone wound me again. In my mind, I imagined a polite gathering, forced smiles, slightly awkward small talk, but at least a minimum level of respect. But the moment I stepped into that house, I realized I had been wrong. What awaited me was a nightmare more cruel than anything I had endured before. In just a few short minutes, my dignity, my self-respect, and even my heart would be turned into entertainment in front of dozens of near strangers. The moment I stepped into the living room, the atmosphere shifted subtly, but unmistakably. More than 30 relatives and guests who had been chatting animatedly suddenly turned to look at me. Curious, scrutinizing, judgmental eyes swept over me from head to toe, making my chest tighten. Before I could even say hello, my mother stood up and pulled me to the center of the room. She was smiling, but the smile was frighteningly cold. "This is our new housekeeper," she announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "She'll be helping in the kitchen and cleaning up tonight." The room fell silent for a few seconds before whispers began to ripple through the crowd. I froze. It felt as if the blood in my veins had turned to ice. My ears rang. My mind went blank. I stood there, unsure how to react. Should I force a smile or defend myself? My face burned, my throat tightened, and my hands trembled uncontrollably. My father sat on the sofa without saying a word. He avoided my gaze, as if I were something shameful. The relatives began looking at me with a mix of pity and disdain. I heard someone murmur, "I thought their daughter was doing quite well for herself." Another person shook their head in disappointment. I understood then they were deliberately humiliating me. They wanted to remind me that in this house, I had never truly been considered part of the family. All my efforts, all my hard work over the years, meant nothing in their eyes. But the most painful part wasn't my mother's cruel introduction. It was the complicit silence of the rest of my blood relatives, the very people who should have protected me the most. I took a deep breath, fighting back tears in front of everyone. Quietly, I lowered my head and walked toward the kitchen under their piercing stares. Each step felt unbearably heavy, as if I were trampling on my own dignity. But I told myself, just get through tonight. After this, I'll leave for good. Then, just as I was setting a tray of food onto the table, a deep, firm voice spoke from behind me. "Excuse me, aren't you the one who signed the investment contract with our company last year?" I turned around. Standing before me was a well-dressed, middle-aged man, the guest of honor my parents had been proudly boasting about all evening, a successful businessman. He looked at me with clear surprise before offering a polite smile. "I'm certain I'm not mistaken," he said loudly. "You're the one who helped our project survive the crisis. You're the CEO of Corporation X, aren't you?" The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Spoons clattered against plates. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Every single pair of eyes shifted toward me. My mother's face drained of color. My father shot up from the sofa, his expression frozen in shock. The air grew thick with tension. The truth they had tried so hard to bury was finally beginning to surface, and I knew that within just a few more minutes, the humiliating performance they had staged would completely collapse. If you've read this far, comment 1 below so I know you're here with me. The room seemed frozen for several long, suffocating seconds. I stood there beneath the stunned gazes of more than 30 people, my heart pounding violently in my chest. The middle-aged man waited calmly for my answer, while my parents began fumbling, trying to interrupt. You, you must be mistaken, my mother stammered, her voice shaking. She's just the help. But the guest gently shook his head, his expression turning firm. He pulled out his phone, opened a photo from a contract signing ceremony, and held it up for everyone to see. In the picture, I was dressed in a tailored suit, standing at the center of the table, signing a multi-million-dollar agreement. There's no mistake, he said decisively. She's the one who negotiated directly with me. Frank Calloway suddenly rose from his seat, visibly astonished, and turned to my father. Richard, you mean to tell me you didn't know your daughter runs Magnolia? She's one of the finest operators in this region. I've trusted her with a multi-million-dollar investment portfolio for the past 2 years. A wave of whispers exploded across the room. My relatives looked at me differently, now shock, admiration, then creeping embarrassment. The same people who had been murmuring insults moments earlier lowered their heads in silence. The truth didn't just humiliate my father, it shattered his deal. When Frank Calloway discovered that my father had lied about the small house being vacant, when in reality, his own daughter and granddaughter were living there, his expression hardened. I don't do business with people who lie to me, Richard, he declared flatly. And just like that, the balance of power in the room shifted completely. My father's face drained of all color. He stood up, forcing a brittle smile, but the corners of his mouth trembled uncontrollably. My mother clenched her hands tightly, panic flashing in her eyes as if she had suddenly lost control of the entire situation. Everything they had carefully staged to belittle me had backfired, turning into a humiliating slap across their own pride. I took a slow, steady breath and lifted my head to look directly at them. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. In that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. I didn't need to prove my worth to anyone, especially not to the people who had never believed in me. And right then, I decided to say something that made the room fall silent once more. I stepped forward, slowly, meeting my parents' eyes without trembling, without looking away. The entire room was still, as if bracing for a storm. Yes, I said, my voice strangely calm. I'm the one who signed that contract. And I'm also the daughter you were never proud of. A few sharp breaths echoed across the room. My father lowered his head. My mother stood frozen, her lips moving but no words coming out. I began telling them everything. About the childhood filled with comparisons and quiet humiliation. About the years I struggled alone in a foreign city, working day and night just to survive. I reminded them of the times I had asked for support and been turned away. Of the cold words that had followed me like a shadow. You can't do it. Stop dreaming. I spoke not with anger but with clarity. Not to seek revenge, but to reclaim my voice. And with every sentence, the silence in the room grew heavier. Every word I spoke sliced through the suffocating tension in the room. One by one, relatives began looking at my parents differently, confused, doubtful, even quietly reproachful. The image of the model family they had so carefully constructed was slowly crumbling before everyone's eyes. I wasn't speaking to accuse them. I only wanted to say one thing. I had risen from the very place where I was once buried, and tonight, I wasn't here to beg for recognition. I was here to close a chapter. When I finished, I felt lighter than I ever had before. But I had no idea that what my father would say next would leave me completely stunned. He stood there in silence for a few seconds. Then suddenly, he let out a dry, hollow laugh. The sound echoed sharply through the still room, sending a chill down everyone's spine. He lifted his head and looked straight at me, no longer avoiding my gaze, but meeting it with cold indifference. If you're so successful, he said slowly, then why haven't you brought money home to support this family all these years? Do you think you're better than us? His words struck like a blade straight through my heart. Any fragile hope I still carried for a final apology shattered instantly. In that moment, I understood with painful clarity. In his eyes, I had never truly been a daughter. I was only ever a comparison to wield, a tool to use when convenient. I smiled. I did send money home, I said calmly. You just never acknowledged it. I waited years to hear a single word of pride. Instead, all I ever received was contempt. The room fell completely silent. My mother lowered her head, her hands clenched tightly, her shoulders trembling. Relatives began whispering again, this time not about me. A few of them shook their heads in disappointment. I turned to the guest and gave him a small nod of gratitude. Without him, the truth might have stayed buried forever. And in that very moment, I made my final decision. I didn't come tonight to celebrate, I said steadily. I came to say goodbye. Then I turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind a room filled with chaos and stunned faces. If you've made it this far, comment 1 below to follow the unexpected ending and my final comeback. I stepped out of the house into the cold yellow glow of a winter evening. The door shut behind me with a dry click, a sound that felt like the final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. No one followed. No one called my name. There were no apologies, no attempts to stop me. Just a heavy silence lingering inside those walls. The air outside was freezing, yet I felt strangely light. For the first time in years, I took a deep breath without feeling pressure tightening around my chest. Tears slid quietly down my face, not from pain, but from release. I walked slowly down the familiar street of my childhood. Every corner, every streetlight, carried memories of a younger version of me, one who had longed desperately to be loved, to be acknowledged. But now, those memories no longer controlled me. They were simply the past. I've come to understand that some families aren't meant to shelter you, they're meant to forge you. If I hadn't endured that pain, perhaps I wouldn't have developed the strength to stand firm in a ruthless business world. Perhaps I wouldn't have been resilient enough to build my career from nothing. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a message from my assistant. The board is waiting for your decision on the acquisition. I paused for a brief moment, then smiled. Maybe fate was preparing something far bigger. A move powerful enough to shift the entire board. And this time, I would not allow anyone to look down on me again. I lifted my head, looked up at the night sky, inhaled deeply, and kept walking. The next morning, I sat in the conference room on the 32nd floor, gazing out through the wide glass windows as the city slowly woke beneath me. In front of me lay the acquisition contract for a real estate company on the brink of bankruptcy. The name on the file made me stop cold. It was the very company legally registered under my father's name. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. So after years of boasting about his success, it had all been a facade. Massive loans, failed projects, years of bleeding red numbers. Every page of the report laid it bare. All it would take was one signature from me, and the entire ownership would transfer to my corporation. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. Only a cold, hollow emptiness. The same parents who had once belittled me, who had humiliated me in front of relatives, were now standing on the edge of collapse without even realizing it. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, letting the storm inside me settle. This wasn't an opportunity for revenge. It was the final test of my dignity and character. I picked up the pen and signed my name slowly. Each stroke of ink felt like the closing of an old chapter and the opening of a new one. From that moment on, everything changed. But I knew the real earthquake had only just begun. And when the truth surfaced, my family wouldn't have time to react. 3 days later, I stood in front of my father's former company headquarters. The building that had once been his pride now looked worn and lifeless. The sign was peeling. The lobby felt half empty. When I walked in, the receptionist looked up, froze for a moment, then quickly stood. The new director is waiting for you upstairs. I stepped into the conference room where my father and several shareholders were seated in heavy silence. The moment he saw me, the color drained from his face. He shot to his feet, his voice trembling. What are you doing here? I calmly placed the folder on the table and gently slid it toward him. I'm here to deliver the board's final decision. His hands shook as he opened it. After reading just a few lines, his expression changed completely. Understanding dawned in his eyes. The company had officially been acquired. All operational control, all assets, now belonged to my corporation. The air in the room was so heavy it felt suffocating. A few shareholders lowered their heads in silence. Others let out quiet, helpless sighs. My father collapsed back into his chair, his eyes empty. For the first time in my life, he looked small. The authority was gone. The arrogance had vanished. All that remained was a man facing the bitter weight of failure. I looked at him, a swirl of emotions rising inside me. Not triumph, not hatred, just a deep, aching sadness. If he had chosen love instead of contempt back then, perhaps everything would have turned out differently. I took a slow breath, then said the words that would completely shatter what little composure he had left. Starting today, I am the owner of this company. The entire room froze. My father's eyes widened in disbelief. He shook his head repeatedly, his lips trembling. That's impossible. You're just the daughter you once looked down on. I cut in calmly. And the same person who signed the contract to acquire your entire corporation. I handed him the official appointment document, the signature and legal seal clearly stamped at the bottom. He stared at it for a long time before his head slowly dropped into his hands. Quiet, broken sobs filled the once silent room. The shareholders remained still. No one spoke. The atmosphere felt thick, like a heavy fog pressing down on everyone's chest. I hadn't come to humiliate him. I had come to end this. I will retain all existing staff, I said calmly. But you will no longer have executive authority. A new management team will take over from here. My father looked up, his eyes red and glassy. For the first time, I saw regret in them. But any apology now would be far too late. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, there were no more accusations, no more cutting words, only a suffocating silence. Out in the hallway, sunlight streamed brightly through the glass windows. In that moment, I knew I was no longer the girl who had once been humiliated and displayed like a spectacle. I was finally free. News of the company's change in ownership spread faster than I expected. Within days, every relative knew that the housekeeper from that Thanksgiving night was now the corporation's new owner. Whispers, speculation, and restless curiosity rippled through the extended family, their questions and stunned glances turning back toward my parents. My mother kept calling and texting, her tone shifting from blame to desperate pleas. She said my father had fallen into a deep depression, suffering from chronic insomnia, barely speaking to anyone. The house that once echoed with forced laughter was now buried under a heavy, suffocating silence. Relatives who had once joined in humiliating me began turning their criticism toward my parents instead. They blamed them for hiding the truth, for treating their own daughter so unjustly. Family gatherings became less frequent. Relationships grew strained, awkward, distant. I stood outside all of it, observing the fallout with a calm heart. I no longer felt anger. I no longer carried resentment. I understood that this was not victory, it was simply the inevitable consequence of years of misguided choices. Everyone pays for the way they treat others, and sometimes the price isn't measured in money, but in the collapse of blood ties. I let out a quiet breath, closing a chapter filled with pain. Yet from it, I learned the greatest lesson of all. Only when you stand firmly on your own 2 feet do you become truly strong. As time passed, I began learning how to slow down. The tense, exhausting workdays were gradually replaced by quiet mornings with a cup of hot coffee, by sunlit afternoon walks along familiar streets. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to rest and to truly listen to my own heart. I started participating in charitable work, supporting young people who once stood where I had stood, children who had been underestimated, deprived of love, starved of encouragement. Each story I heard softened something inside me. And I realized, not everyone is fortunate enough to be strong enough to rise above their wounds alone. The old wounds inside me slowly began to heal. I no longer dreamed of overdue apologies, nor did I crave recognition from my family. Instead, I learned to be proud of myself, of the path I had chosen, of every time I stood back up after falling. One evening, as I watched the city lights shimmer beyond my window, I suddenly understood something simple yet profound. The past cannot be changed, but the way we move forward can. I was no longer the child standing silently in the kitchen. I was no longer the young woman trembling under contemptuous stares. I had become someone steadier, stronger, and at peace. I smiled and whispered softly to myself, "Everything will be okay." And for the first time, it wasn't a comforting lie, it was the truth.